In the summer of 1936, crowds packed station platforms across the Midwest, not to board a train, but to see one. Indeed, they came for a glimpse of a machine that looked less like something built by a railroad and more like a spacecraft. It was called the Mercury, and in its day, it represented a different kind of promise, one where speed, style, and science merged into a single streak of motion. But the Mercury wasn't just fast. It was astonishing. At night, its driving wheels, which would usually be hidden under the steam locomotive's grime, were illuminated by concealed floodlights, glowing like machinery from a science fiction film. And inside, passengers stepped into something even more surreal for 1936, a climate-controlled interior, built with quiet vestibules, curved lounges, and a dining room arranged like a private club. Onboard service was complete with banquette seating, exotic menu selections, and an atmosphere that didn't feel like a train at all. Yet today, most Americans have never even heard of the Mercury. So how did a train this advanced, this beautiful and ahead of its time get lost to history? And what was it really like to ride inside a machine the newspapers once called the train of tomorrow? Stay tuned to find out, as today we uncover the story of America's lost Mercury train. I'm your host Ryan Sokash, and you're watching It's History. This story really begins with the Art Deco movement of the 1920s and early 30s, when Americans were redesigning entire cities as declarations of modernity. Across the country, the ornate textures of the Victorian age had begun to feel heavy and outdated. You see, mass production demanded clearer lines, and the First World War had pushed practicality over the ornate. And finally, the Great Depression made lavish excess seem tasteless. In this climate, Art Deco emerged as an aesthetic of progress, everything that the old world was not. And importantly here, the notion was evident in everything from skyscrapers to posters and even everyday objects like kitchen appliances. Furthermore, the shift didn't happen in isolation. A similar phenomenon was observed in much of the Western world. Basically, Art Deco promised escape through beauty and confidence through innovation, and the civilized world needed both. Hence, by the early 1930s, this trend reached one of the most influential industries of the day, the railroads. Now, for railroad executives, the value this cultural shift represented were also a practical solution for their future. We're talking about speed, efficiency, and class. Since by the mid-1930s, they saw the writing on the wall. The automobile would replace the train, meaning trains had to do more than transportation. They had to be experiences. This is where the New York Central Railroad saw an opportunity. If Art Deco could make skyscrapers look like monuments to progress, and if streamlined design could sell cars and appliances as futuristic miracles, then surely it could do the same for rail travel. Enter industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss, a man whose philosophy blended aesthetics with pure function. To be fair, railroads had experimented with streamlining before, but they never really followed through. So Dreyfuss approached the problem differently. He imagined a train where every surface, inside and out, adhered to the Art Deco ideal: smooth, integrated, and intentional. That's right, this dream would become the Mercury. Once the New York Central approved the radical proposal, the project moved quickly. But here's the surprising thing. When Henry first submitted his plans for the Mercury, the New York Central loved the concept, but hated the cost. His proposal called for brand new state-of-the-art lightweight cars, but when the bids came in, they were so expensive that the entire project was nearly canceled. Dreyfuss later wrote that receiving that news was, quote, a heavy blow, and so he stepped away from the project to clear his head. Though a solution came fast. Apparently on his train ride home, as he was passing through the Maud Haven yards in the Bronx, he noticed something most designers would have ignored: a long line of retired suburban commuter coaches, weather-beaten, outdated, and on the railroad's scrap list. And I want to be clear here. These were utilitarian cars from an earlier era and offered none of the elegance needed for a premier streamliner. In fact, by the mid-1930s, the carriages were considered functionally obsolete, but Dreyfuss realized that beneath the rust and dents, these cars actually had one crucial advantage: they were structurally solid. With that in mind, he rushed back to New York Central leadership and made yet another bold proposal. Don't buy new cars, rebuild from scrap. And by doing so, the Mercury could be created for 1/4 of the cost of the original design, a fact explicitly recorded in Dreyfuss's own recollection of the project. The Central agreed, and from there, the battered cars were hauled from New York all the way to Beech Grove in Indiana, where they were completely gutted down to bare steel. Workers stripped out old partitions and rebuilt the interiors into sweeping, club-like environments that would come to define the Mercury. The transformation was so complete that most passengers and most reporters never even realized that they were traveling inside of what, for a lack of better words, had previously been set aside as garbage. And just like that, by June of 1936, the first set was ready for its test run. It was taken onto a 200-mile stretch of track between Indianapolis and Sheff, Indiana, where witnesses were awestruck by its speed. Newspapers reported that the Mercury, quote, attained 93 miles per hour, which, again, was astonishing for a train of that era and for a rebuilt set. So, with the tests complete, on June the 25th, 1936, the train was officially christened in Indianapolis, with the ceremony fitting of an ocean liner. According to the Indianapolis Star, crowds packed shoulder to shoulder as officials shattered a bottle of champagne against the locomotive's shiny prow. And then it left for a publicity tour, visiting cities like Cleveland, Toledo, and New York, each event attracting thousands of spectators. Chicago alone saw 17,250 visitors in just one day when the train was on display at the LaSalle Street station. And soon enough, the train entered passenger service. The Mercury's first assignment was a daily round trip between Cleveland and Detroit. These two terminus points connected in just 2 hours and 50 minutes, a schedule so tight that many doubted it was possible, until of course the train performed it daily. That success led to the introduction of the Chicago Mercury and later Cincinnati Mercury, widening the family of routes radiating from Detroit. Timetables of 1936 through 1949 show how the Central used these trains like pieces on a chessboard, each positioned to make Midwestern travel measurably faster, more elegant, and more modern than anything Americans had seen before. And let me tell you, as fascinating as this train was from the exterior, the real shock came once you stepped on board. Inside the train, Dreyfuss had created a kind of rolling social club. Vestibules were widened into semicircular transitions, fabric buffers softened vibrations, and indirect lighting made the room glow with an almost cinematic warmth. In the dining car, tables for two lined the aisle like a restaurant, with a small waiting lounge where travelers could sip coffee until their seating was ready. The parlor car contained a private 6-seat compartment, something usually reserved for first-class ocean liners. But the most dramatic flourish was the observation car, since Dreyfuss lowered the windowsills by a full foot, creating panoramic glass walls that wrapped around the train's rear. Moreover, instead of placing seating along the perimeter, which had always been the standard practice, he installed a center cluster of banquettes facing outward. From there, passengers could watch the landscape on spool behind them while consulting a built-in speedometer, proudly displaying the Mercury's mile-minute pace. So that's all amazing, but I bet you're wondering what people ate on board. Well, menus from the period confirm that the dining experience was equally astonishing for a Depression-era train. Breakfast featured things like broiled grapefruit, lamb chops, and fresh ground coffee, whereas lunch offered Lake Erie whitefish, club sandwiches, or omelets made to order. And of course, dinner included roast prime rib, cold cured ham, oysters, and seasonal desserts. And I want you to remember that these weren't luxury upgrades. They were standard offerings. So it was a comfortable ride for everyone on board, especially since the climate control kept every room at an even temperature. And the smooth, continuous curves of the train's interior made the cars feel less like separate compartments and more like chambers of a single, sculpted environment. Basically, this was the full realization of Art Deco escapism, yet the good times would not last forever. For all its brilliance, the Mercury carried a flaw that no designer no matter how forward-thinking, could entirely overcome. It was a high-speed, precision-built streamliner running on a Midwestern network, still full of grade crossings, aging infrastructure, and unpredictable conditions. And even from its earliest days, the consequences of that mismatch were disastrous. The first warning came on July the 15th, 1936, which you may recall was the very first day that the Mercury entered revenue service. According to the Battle Creek Enquirer, the train struck a car at a level crossing during its first run from Cleveland to Detroit, killing the automobile's driver in the process. A tragic introduction to the reality of operating a mile-a-minute train on the open rural tracks. Newspapers reported that the crew would be, quote, quizzed in the crossing mishap, emphasizing just how shocking it was for a brand new flagship service to begin with such an incident. But the most dramatic collision occurred 2 years later. On February the 10th, 1938, the Sandusky Register reported that the Mercury struck a truck at a crossing, hurling the vehicle, quote, several hundred feet from the point of impact. The train was damaged, but stayed upright just long enough for the crew to bring it to a full stop at the next block signal. Then, what happened next terrified the public further. While the Mercury sat disabled on the main line, the powerful Commodore Vanderbilt, running just minutes behind, rounded the curve and collided with the rear of the stopped Streamliner. More than 30 passengers were seriously injured. And although no one passed, the image of these two trains colliding was terrible for the Mercury's PR. Multiple papers, including the Indianapolis News, cited wet rails as the cause, noting how the Vanderbilt engineer applied the brakes, but, quote, the wheels slipped, making a full stop impossible. And this was not an isolated event, as it was only one of several major passenger rail accidents reported in 1938. And as years passed, other incidences followed. A 1940 crash in Michigan completely destroyed an automobile, pushing its remains nearly 3/4 of a mile down the track and killing the driver instantly. Another report from December of 1940 described someone jumping in front of the Mercury in Niles, Michigan. That's all to say that the Mercury was fast, but fast meant unforgiving. But accidents would not be the train's undoing, as another unforgiving sentiment of the time was the change of technology around transportation in general. By the late 1940s, the landscape of American travel shifted. Highways expanded, cars became more reliable, and commercial airlines emerged as the new aspirational mode of transportation. With that, post-war ridership patterns also changed. The Mercury family, once the sleek embodiment of Art Deco, found itself competing against a country that increasingly preferred the freedom of the open road. That's right, the railroads were in a downward spiral. And then, in 1950, something happened that changed everyone's perspective. The westbound Detroit-Chicago Mercury was briefly suspended due to a nationwide coal shortage, a state of affairs resulting from an Interstate Commerce Commission order affecting all coal-powered trains. Eventually, service resumed in the following month, but the disruption revealed how fragile the economics of passenger rail had become. Attendance numbers dwindled throughout the decade. Advertising from the mid-50s still promoted the Mercury as one of the 6 happy ways to Chicago, but the optimism rang hollow. Piece by piece, the puzzle came apart. Route consolidation began. The Cincinnati Mercury was eliminated in October of 1956. The Chicago Mercury disappeared in April of '58, and so on and so on. Meanwhile, the equipment itself, though ingeniously rebuilt, began to show its age. Passengers complained of weird creaking sounds, uncomfortable vibrations, and so on. And fixing these issues was far beyond what the cost-strained railroad could justify. Finally, in the summer of 1959, the decision was made. Timetables released for July showed the Cleveland Mercury's last westbound journey taking place on July the 11th, 1959, meaning the 23-year run was finally over. Today, almost nothing physical remains of the Mercury. The cars were promptly withdrawn, stripped of their interiors, and either reassigned to lesser duties or scrapped outright as the New York Central modernized its fleet. What remains are basically fragments, things like menus, photographs, scattered components maybe, and the occasional blueprint. And it's not surprising, since after World War II, Art Deco gave way to mid-century modernism, a style shaped by suburban expansion, new materials, and the rise of consumerism. And these two things didn't fit together. Where Art Deco expressed optimism through ornamentation and geometry, the mid-century modern movement favored simplicity, openness, and practicality. Basically, a more individualistic idea of the American future. And it needs to be said that as that movement took hold, America didn't just lose its stylish train. It lost many of the buildings, interiors, and artistic ambitions that defined the Art Deco era. Entire city blocks of theaters, stations, and storefronts were demolished in the name of modernization, which raises a question. Will we ever return to a world that embraces imagination so boldly? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, and hit that subscribe button to see what we do next. Otherwise, until next time, I'm Ryan Socash, signing off.